Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachael Kangas, and I work for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. I'm the director of our Central and West Central regions. So today we're going to talk about one of the ways that we have tried to answer the question, what do we save? So we did a cultural resource vulnerability assessment in Collier County, Florida, using the ACUNE tool that Mike explained a few minutes ago. So I just kind of want to go through a little bit of what we did and why we did it. So as we're all aware, some of the problems that we're dealing with are sea level rise that's caused by climate change. I saw his Miami Herald article from last week that said in the year 2100, there will be one day in the year 2100 where nuisance high tide flooding isn't an issue in Fort Myers. So great. So that's one of the problems. Also, cultural sites aren't usually included in planning projects and these long-term projects that different municipalities work on, which is an issue in and of itself, but especially an issue when we're talking about how to balance our cultural sites with development, changes in where people are living, whether they're leaving the coast and moving inland, right? We need to worry about the coast or the sites on the coast and also the sites that are going to be developed on further inland, emergency management, and of course, limited budgets. And basically it all comes down to the idea that we cannot make smart decisions about resources without the ability to prioritize them. So with those problems in mind, we came up with a project to do a vulnerability assessment, again, for the cultural resources in Collier County, Florida. Part of this was as a way to test the ACUNE tool's abilities to, kind of help in a real world project. And I'm very glad that we got to do that. So the first thing that we did, and the most important thing for anyone ever trying to do this, is to create a working group that is representative of the communities that you are working with, or that you're working in. So we were really fortunate to have a wonderful working group that included land managers and local leaders from diverse communities to help choose the 10 case study sites that I'll talk about in just a minute. So we had involvement from the Seminole Tribe, Rookery Bay, the NAACP of Collier County, Coalition of Motley Workers, and many others. So we were really fortunate in our working group. And if you want to read it, we've got the QR code up there, and I'll show it at the end as well. So a little bit of information about Collier County for anyone who might not be familiar. So first of all, of course, we are on native land. This is land of the Seminole Tribe of Florida, as well as native people who have been here for millennia before, during, and since European invasion and colonization. So that's always important to keep in mind as we're working on this land. According to the Florida Master Site File, which is the official list of cultural sites in Collier County, there are 1,557 cultural sites in the county. So that's archaeological sites, bridges, cemeteries, historic structures, things like that. But it's really important to remember that this is not all of the sites that exist in Collier County. These are just the sites that someone has filled out a form to put on the Florida Master Site File. So of course, it is biased towards a very privileged history. And when we look at sea level rise in Collier County, our sea levels are slightly higher than the global average. At least when we started doing this, they might have fixed that with some of the new projections that have come out. So when we did our vulnerability assessment, we had two main goals. The first goal was fairly simple. It was to do a full county site count. So we used the ACUNE tool to model in the top right here, a current or 2020 100-year flood. And then we went to 2030 and looked at the median sea level rise curve, which adds about 3 inches of water to the sea level. And then we did a 100-year flood for that. And we went through and we literally counted every site that had any water on it. So in 2020, with that scenario, we counted 267 sites that would be impacted by flooding. And in our 2030 medium sea level rise model, we counted 318. So that is a change of 51 sites over the course of 10 years, which really helps to crystallize that if we want a choice in what's going to get saved and how this is going to go down, we have to start making those choices now, and we have to start planning now. The second goal is a little more complicated, so it's going to take a couple of slides to explain. But the second goal was our prioritization and scoring framework that we use to then prioritize or that can be used to prioritize sites. So we did not have time to go through all 1,557 cultural sites in Collier County. So what we wanted to do is we chose 10 case study sites. These were submitted, voted on, and chosen by our working group as a whole, which again is why it's so important that the working groups are not just land managers and officials, that it's really, you do the best that you can to get a representation of the people in the county. So we chose 10 sites. We were going for well-known, publicly accessible, publicly interpreted sites so that we can do public presentations and share information about these sites with everyone. So these are our 10 sites. You can kind of see where they're organized around the county. So the first thing that we did for our prioritization framework and scoring was we scored exposure. So for exposure, we looked at these 13 different scenarios that include both flooding and nuisance. So storm flooding and nuisance flooding. And basically the percentage of these tested scenarios that a site has water on it, each one counts. And then we made that into a percentage. So as an example, the Ochoque Post Office, which is in the Everglades, it's the smallest post office in the country. It will experience some water in 9 of our 13 scenarios, which means that it scores a 69% for exposure. So it's exposed to flooding in 69% of those 13 scenarios. The next thing that we scored on was consequence of inaction. And this is something that we did not see in almost any other vulnerability assessment that we looked at. We kind of modified this from a study that ACUNE did from the city of Naples. So this, usually when you look at a vulnerability assessment, it's, what do we do? All of this idea about what can we do to save it. But very rarely do we see people looking at what happens if we don't do anything. What are the consequences of our inaction? So we looked at 3 different things for consequence. Environmental consequence, so a lot of sites are places where protected species might live. Social consequence for sites that are, pillars of their community, and economic consequence. So like museums and places that bring in revenue and visitorship. So what is the consequence in those 3 categories if a site is destroyed? So as an example, we looked at Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church, which is part of the River Park community. So this church is a huge part of the Black community in Naples, Florida. It is a place where people come together to create, their community. It's also a place where people come together to get resources that aren't available in other places in their community. They sponsor events there. So if the site is destroyed, you can see the consequence scores down here. So environmentally, it won't have a huge impact if the site is flooded. There aren't, protected species living on the site, things like that. However, the social and economic consequences will be very severe if this site is destroyed. Again, it's a pillar of its community, and it brings in revenue and it helps people connect economically with the community. So you would take these 3 scores, average them together to get a total consequence score. I will put all these together in a couple slides, I promise. Hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. So that's our consequence scores. And then the last thing we looked at was vulnerability. So we looked at both sensitivity, so how sensitive is the site to being flooded if it is a building that has a bunch of wiring and it gets flooded and that wiring is ruined. That might be a bigger issue or make it more sensitive than like a huge site, like a big shell work site that may, maybe it's not really going to impact it a whole lot if it floods. So sensitivity and then adaptive capacity. How adaptive is the site? If it's a small structure like the Ochoque Post Office, you can literally pick it up and move it. However, for a giant shell work site, that is not an option. So it might not be as adaptive, at least in that way. So as an example, we can look at Dismal Key, which is in the 10,000 Islands area. So this is a huge shell work site. And you can see our vulnerability scores over on the left there. So for sensitivity, it's 4 to 2. It's going to be impacted by flooding. It is pretty sensitive to flooding. However, we will still probably be able to do archaeological research at least if the site is submerged. And it gets a surprisingly decent adaptive capacity score with a 1.5. So basically, even though the site is going to be flooded and it'll likely have some erosion and some damage as that process occurs, once the site site is underwater from what we know of other shell work sites that are submerged, there's a decent chance that it might actually be okay once it is actually underwater. And if the site is really, what we're looking at for the site is really the archaeological knowledge, we could still potentially get that even when it's submerged. So I will not go too much into detail, but we did all of these scores for all 10 sites. We put them together into a table. And the thing that I want everybody to take away from this is, based on your planning and management focus, you can use this prioritization to focus on whatever it is that you have resources to deal with. So let's say you're focused on vulnerability. Rosemary Cemetery might be a really great site to look at. So that's the third up from the bottom. So Rosemary Cemetery isn't going to be, it's only exposed in 15% of those scenarios that we looked at. So it doesn't get exposed to flooding until some of the later flood scenarios that we look at. However, once it is impacted, it is incredibly vulnerable. It's a cemetery, it's difficult to move, and it's part of the community. So if you're looking at vulnerability, that might be a site that you would want to focus on. You have some time, and you should be able to make a pretty big impact if you can come up with a good solution. So now would be the time to act if you are worried about vulnerability and looking at Rosemary Cemetery. Just some conclusions. So basically, you can use the scoring method, and this is not, the end all be all of scoring methods. I would love to hear people's input on this. It was really enlightening listening to the panel with the Seminole Tribe earlier and kind of getting some input from them and hearing their ideas and how they're doing their vulnerability assessment. But you can use the scoring method on any size study. Just a park. You can use a flood map. You can use anything like that and still apply this method. It's useful for deciding appropriate actions based on, again, your management planning, focus, and capabilities. And you can use it in combination with any flood map. So you can do a vulnerability analysis, and then when an amazing tool like ACUNE is available, you can do it again and just change the flood maps and the accuracy of the flood maps. And finally, our recommendations. We would recommend that every county in the state of Florida does something like this. We think a county level assessment, it would be better than a state level assessment, because when you get as big as a state, we worry that you're going to lose some of those communities that are present at the county level that might kind of get overlooked when you go to a state level. So we would recommend using it at a county level or lower. And like I mentioned a few times, it is absolutely imperative that anytime anyone is doing a study like this, that you are doing everything you can to have an equitable, representative stakeholder group. So make sure that you do that work up front to make sure that, like Juan said earlier, you can have the best science in the world, but if the community doesn't care, then it doesn't matter. And land managers and archaeologists, as much as we love these sites, we cannot represent the total cultural importance of them. So thank you very much. Again, QR code if you'd like to see the whole